Tonight we're talking about thermaling. Thermaling 101, I like to call it. This is the message that I would give to every pilot who's just starting to learn how to thermal. And the little cartoon graphics here on the front are a slight exaggeration, but when I learned a few key things about 10 years into my flying, I made a transformation in my ability to thermal that's almost what you see here. So it was a shock to me that after 10 years I could that quickly and suddenly get better at thermaling. So it took me a few years to really boil down what it was I learned and how to present it in some sort of a clear method. So that's what I'm going to try to do tonight. First, let me start by explaining what I think is the 101 of thermaling, the first thing to learn. And I think that it's staying in a thermal, simply staying in it. I think that's the first place to start in learning to thermal. I don't believe it's where to find thermals, which is often where we start when we teach people about thermaling. We start with where they are, what they are, how they work. But I submit to you that you'll accidentally find a lot more thermals than you will accidentally stay in long enough to matter. And even the pros, which I'm not one of them, but I hear, even they find about half of their thermals by dumb luck. You know, they may be better than we are at picking where to find them, but half the time they blunder into one where they weren't expecting it. So if you have those kind of odds of simply finding thermals, if you can find a lot of thermals without even trying, but you can't stay in thermals without trying, then I think it makes good sense to start your training on the thing that is not going to happen by accident. The 101 is also not maximizing climb rate, in my opinion. So tonight we're not talking about expert level, advanced thermaling, climbing the very fastest you can. I have found this to be true in my own flying and with some of the pilots I've worked with, that if you try to improve your climb rate, if that's your focus in thermals, without having first mastered the skill of simply being able to stay in them, then you'll often get worse thermaling results. I think this is a big part of why I was stuck for 10 years with sort of ho-hum thermaling ability. And if you slip out of your thermal, if you fall out of it, you can easily undo several minutes worth of the small incremental gain in climb rate you might get by going from basic thermaling to advanced type of thermaling. So I say it's not worth the risk of losing the thermal to try to climb a little bit faster. First, work on staying in the thermal, and then once you're sure you can do that, then work on climbing faster. Here's my notion of the ideal order of learning thermaling. One, like I already said, is learn to stay in the thermals you find. Then, learn to find what I like to call near-miss thermals. These are thermals you sort of went through the outer edge of, maybe just through sync, or maybe through lift light enough that your vario either didn't beep at all or just barely beeped. And I have a lecture on that topic. I'd say that's probably the number 2 most useful lecture in the course behind the one we're doing tonight. Next, learn just where to generally search for thermals. So learn to improve your odds of finding thermals. Then, learn to climb faster. So after you've gotten decent at, good at staying in the thermals you find, good at finding the thermals you just didn't quite blunder straight into the middle of, and learn a little bit about where to find thermals in general, then I think maybe that's the right time to focus on trying to climb faster. And maybe then learn some thermal theory, although along the way it's somewhat necessary to learn a little bit of theory, but I'm of the opinion that I like to give the most practical bang for your buck information up first to a beginner and fill in as little theory as is needed to get them good results. And once they're having good results and good long thermaling flights, then you can afford to dive into theory. But if you spend a lot of time in theory first, it's hard to glean good practical stuff out of pure theory discussions. And a lot of the books I've read, books, series of magazine articles, lectures by the pros at contests, so forth, seem to take the opposite order here. Or at best, maybe they jumble some of these ideas all together and don't sort out for the beginner who doesn't know which are the most important fundamental lessons. So the beginner is left to sift through piles and piles of information, not knowing which is the most important. Tonight we'll just be talking about this, just learning to stay in the thermals you find. So hopefully you'll find that the lesson is clear, simple, and conservative. By conservative I mean its emphasis is on not losing thermals. That's what I mean by conservative. And I hope it has something for everyone, because we have guys in here tonight all across the spectrum. We don't have any total beginners in here, I don't think, but we have some that have just been flying a year or two, and we have some that have been flying 10 years or more. But hopefully there's something here tonight for everyone. Most importantly, I hope if you're losing more thermals than you'd like right now, hopefully it'll help you lose fewer. If you're already not losing that many thermals, but maybe you feel exhausted by the time you get to the top of a thermal, physically and or mentally, then maybe you'll pick up on something here that'll help you have just as good of results without as much effort. And if you're already not losing too many thermals and you're doing it with relative ease, then maybe this will give you some ideas for how to help the beginners who are very far away from your skill level right now and don't necessarily need to be taught how you thermal, but need to be taught a beginner-friendly, simple way. Several years ago, I put out a survey, monkey survey, to hang glider and paraglider pilots in my area, and I found, because I suspected some things, so I put out the survey and asked some questions, and I found that about half of the surveyed intermediate rated pilots, that's what H3P3 means, and about half of them reported losing half or more of the thermals they find. And I was careful in the question to say, don't count it as lost if you think it was simply unworkable or dead. If it was too narrow, too turbulent, or had died, don't count it. Only count the ones that you think they were kind of pretty good and solid, and you just sort of got lost trying to track this thermal and lost it. Now, given that human nature is what it is, and we're sort of protective of our egos, I expect that the truth is a little worse than what this survey found. I think, though, that it's a reasonable goal to lose only 10%, maybe less, and with a relatively comfortable level of effort. I would have laughed at you if you told me this when I'd been flying for 8 years, but I believe it's true now that I've figured out a better way to thermal than I was doing then. And I share this with you largely to say that if you're losing too many thermals, you're not alone. And maybe also to help point out to you that the less experience, if you aren't losing too many thermals, then look around you at your flying club. A lot of the pilots with less than 10 years of experience they're losing a lot of thermals, and they're frustrated by it often. So maybe there's a need there that you haven't recognized before. Maybe you can help those guys. All right, let's get into a little practical stuff. The first question when you encounter a thermal is, when do you start turning? Because you can essentially lose a thermal before you've even gotten into it really well. Ideally, and what we're looking at here is we're looking down on a cross section of the thermal, and I've color coded the lift strength. So red is where you'd like to be. You're climbing really well. The yellow-orange, you're climbing not so well. Green is lift, but it's so weak that your vario doesn't beep. So you're not descending as fast as if you were outside of the thermal, but you're not climbing either. And the blue is sink, with the black dashed line just being the worst part of the sink. You can think of it as a trough, a moat around the thermal, and that's the bottom, the deepest part. So ideally, you'd like to start your turn right when you're in the middle of the thermal, halfway through it. But we don't have any way to know that for sure, so that's not the greatest answer. But what if you turn a little early or a little too late? As long as you turn close enough to the ideal time that some part of your first circle is in lift, that's good enough. So assuming once you start turning, you just hold that bank in airspeed, and a full circle later you come back and you're still in lift, that's good. We can work with that. You have not lost the thermal, even though half your circle may be in sink, like it's drawn here. And for the moment, let's not think about wind. Let's assume calm wind, and you'll see why in a minute. I'll bring wind into the discussion in a little bit later. It's very unlikely that you'll turn so soon that you lose the thermal. Now, you could turn so soon that you miss the best core, but we're not talking about climbing as fast as possible tonight. We're talking about simply not losing a workable thermal. It's highly unlikely you'll turn too soon. I mean, given the drawing here, you'd have to turn before you even hit any lift to have your vario not even beep. The most common mistake I see is waiting too late. There are all sorts of reasons. There are lags in the system. There's lags in the physics of, takes a little bit of time from when you put your glider into a different vertical flow of air and when it responds. I mean, it's quick, but there's a tiny lag there. There's a lag in your vario. You can count on your vario being about a second, maybe a second and a half behind reality. That's an important point that a lot of us don't learn and make good use of till we've been flying a long time. There's human reaction time. So there's a little bit of lag between when you decide that you want to do it and when you physically do it. There's lag in your glider's response. You can't instantly change from your gliding speed and wings level to your circling pitch and bank. It takes a little bit of time. Even when you just move the stick over, it takes a little bit of time for the glider to start rolling. So add all these little things up, and there's one here I didn't even mention that can be a big one, and that's the hope that we're about to hit something better, even better. That one can cause us to fly way too far and then go, there's nothing better, let me turn around. And I'll help you with that in a second. But the most important point here is you're much more likely to lose the thermal before you even get started in it by waiting too late to circle than by starting circling too early. I think a very good rule, at a minimum, is to try to have your turn established. So I mean, be at your circling pitch and bank that you intend to hold for the whole next circle before you stop climbing. If you do that, then part of your first circle will be in lift. You'll come back to lift before you've completed your first circle. There's a common rule of thumb. A lot of pilots fly by this rule of thumb, and it's not a bad one. They'll say, well, I'll start turning after so many seconds of good climbing. 3 seconds is probably the number I hear the most often, and that's not a bad rule. If you just do the geometry, the calculation that circumference is about 3 times diameter, pi times diameter, and pi is about 3, then if you just flew all the way across that thermal and never turned, if you had X number of seconds of climbing, then a 3x duration circle would keep you in the thermal. So let's say it was 7 seconds of climbing if you just flew all the way across it and never turned. Well, then a 21-second circle would be right at the outer edges of that lift. So you might look at this and go, well, wait a minute. If pilots turn after just 3 seconds, that means I'd need a 9-second duration circle to fit in that lift. And I don't know if you've tried it before, but 9 seconds in a sailplane is extreme. You're probably going to get a terrible sink rate at 9 seconds. 20 is pretty standard, but we'll get to that. But I think part of the reason this works is, one, remember our vario lag. So most pilots would implement this as after 3 seconds of beeping. So you can add a second or a second and a half, and now you have 4.5 seconds. So now you're up to a 12 or 13 second circle would fit in here, but still that's pretty small. That's a pretty steep bank. And unless the lift is strong, you're not going to be able to climb. So I think the other part of why this works pretty well is there's a bit of a gamble involved in this rule of thumb. And the gamble, the bet, is that there's still a few more seconds of lift ahead of me. So if you figure that in, then at 3 seconds, which is really 4 or 4.5, you're assuming there's another 3 or 4 seconds ahead of you. Now you're talking 7 or 8 seconds across, and a circle and an area of lift big enough to fit your circle in. So it's a fair rule of thumb, but I would caution you. Who says we're going to always center punch a thermal and punch right into the best part of it? So often enough, we nick it to one side, and our perception might be, oh, that's way too narrow or too weak, when really we could just be on the outer edge of something really good. So I would not use the 3-second rule to say I won't turn unless I get at least 3 seconds of strong beeping. I wouldn't use the rule that way. But I think it's reasonable to say if I got 3 seconds of good strong beeping, it's probably good enough time to go ahead and turn. Another good rule that doesn't necessarily involve counting, well, it just doesn't, is as soon as your climb rate drops significantly, I say definitely, yes. Maybe the only exception is if you didn't get 3 seconds of lift yet, or if it was just a second or two. Even then, I might go ahead and turn just to explore and see whether maybe I'm over to the side of a good core. Maybe an even better rule is start turning as soon as your climb rate quits increasing. So remember the lag, and especially if you're keying off the vario for making these determinations. If you're keying off the vario, then right before you even hear it stop increasing is when you should start turning, because right about there, you're theoretically at the strongest part of that thermal. So what if you blow it? We all blow it sometimes. Sometimes I just have a mental lapse and don't start turning, or maybe I'm hopeful that there's something better ahead and I find out there's not. It's no big deal. If you're just a few seconds late, then you just do a 270 and roll back level for a few seconds, and that'll put you back into a decent part of the thermal. If you waited several seconds too late, then do the same thing, only stretch out what I call the backtrack leg. So do a 180, then level out for about how many seconds you think you overshot. Then do a 90 and you should punch right into it. So it can be fixed with this little simple technique if you wait too late. So a summary, that was a lot of words about just when to start turning, but it's a question I get asked a lot. Any climbing in your circle is good for now. That's like being in the dark, you're blind, but you have your hand on something safe. You're not all the way over to it yet, but you kind of know where it is. You have a hand on it. Waiting too long is the most common mistake. 5 seconds of climbing is plenty for a 15-second circle. And since we usually don't center punch thermals, they're usually bigger than we think, based on what we experience as we fly through them. Definitely turn no later than when climb rate has started dropping significantly. If you waited a little too late, make a 270 to fix it. If you waited a lot too late, 180, then straight for how long you think you overshot, then turn. Alright, soon we're going to start talking about how to make centering adjustments, when to make centering adjustments. So let me define what I mean by centering adjustment. I've found over the years that not everyone means the same thing, and not everyone even likes the term. So, whatever. It's the term I'm going to use, and here's what I mean. It's a deliberate deviation from a steady airspeed, steady bank, thermaling circle. I've already hinted to you that that's sort of a fundamental of thermaling, for the purpose of getting higher faster. So it's deliberate. It didn't accidentally happen. It's not something that happened because of turbulence. That turbulence might adjust your circle for you, but I would not call that a centering adjustment. It assumes the platform of a steady airspeed, steady bank circle. It assumes you're thermaling. Centering adjustment doesn't mean anything if you're not thermaling. And the point is getting higher faster. It's not, in a gaggle, you might make a centering adjustment just to conform to the gaggle, even if you think they're in the wrong place to get the best climb. You might make a deviation from your circle just to avoid a collision. I would not call that a centering adjustment. That's a safety adjustment. So I'm curious, are any of you frustrated now with how often you lose thermals? It's just to let me know my audience. Okay, good. Well, good. I'm glad to hear we have at least some of you in here that need this message. And hopefully I can help you out. I had been flying for 10 years in a hang glider. So, I could make 150-foot diameter circles. You couldn't touch that with a PW5 or 126. My thermaling airspeed was about 25 knots. So that's what I was flying after 10 years, and I still was frustrated with how often I lost thermals. So you can lose thermals in anything, and you can stay in thermals in just about anything. That sort of surprised me when I moved up to sailplanes to realize just how big thermals really are. Because I fly an LS3, and it fits in thermals just fine. It fits in. I've hardly found a thermal it wouldn't fit in. So, for those of you that said you're frustrated with how often you're losing thermals, I'm curious how often. Be careful. I'm gonna repeat part of this question because it often gets overlooked. I'd like your answer. How often are centering adjustments, as I just defined them, needed in a typical thermal, one that's decent, one that you know other pilots can work, how often are centering adjustments needed to simply not lose the thermal? So if your only goal is don't lose the thermal, how often do you think centering adjustments are needed? Well, good, thank you. I think by the end of tonight you'll have a good idea what my answer is. If you watch the Easy as 1, 2, 3 video, you already have a good clue. And I just heard some answers that are typical in a broad spread of experience levels. You'll find the pilots that are not losing thermals, they have the freedom to try to emphasize maximizing their climb rate, and can do that without losing the thermals. So if you ask a guy like that how to thermal, he tends to talk to you as if you asked him how to maximize climb rate. But for someone who's losing too many thermals, I would submit to you that he needs to not listen to that advice and not think that way yet. Don't try to maximize climb rate. Try to simply not lose the thermal. One of the nicest things I learned from Condor, the simulator, because it has the ability to let you turn on thermal helpers, make them visible so you can look, is after a thermal that I felt like was particularly snaky or twisting, or challenging, I could, as I fly away from it, go into external view, look from nose to tail, look behind me, turn on thermal helpers, and see just how snaky was that thermal. And I learned that my assessment of how snaky a thermal was not very accurate. More times than not, I was blaming the thermal for being snakier than it really was. And when I calmed down my thermaling some and quit making so many adjustments, I found, wait a minute, this thermal isn't snaking away from me nearly as much as I've said for so long that they tend to do. And I applied that in real life and found, well, what do you know? Real life thermals aren't as snaky as I thought either. So it's easy to get this idea in our head when we make one pass around the circle and it's a little bit uneven in Vario. We think, oh no, it's moving that way, I better go or I'm going to lose it. Well, even if it is snaky, it's not going to snake that much in 1 or 2 circles. So I would encourage you, if you're losing too many and you think you're making a lot of adjustments or you have that sort of mindset of chasing snaky thermals, to maybe test that theory by resisting to make some adjustments. Most teaching on just about any subject is how to get the last 20% of skill or performance. I think that just seems to be the nature of things. That the more experienced and advanced you get, the more effort you have to put into it to get a tiny increment better. So for 20% of the total effort you'll ever put into something, you are 80% as good as you could ever be. And then you can spend the rest of your life trying to get that last 20%. These are somewhat made up numbers, but you get the idea. And I think we probably all agree that this last 20% type of advice is rarely helpful for someone who's not at the 80% point yet. You don't sit a 5-year-old down with a calculus book and say, all right, we're going to learn calculus. You might eventually get them to calculus, but probably the fastest, easiest way to get them there is to start with the basics. You don't set someone down at a piano and give them a complex piece of music to learn on. You give them Mary Had a Little Lamb. So there are reasons we do these sorts of things. I think we have not done so good at applying this concept in our soaring training. So I try real hard to do this. I'm not perfect at it, but I try. This is one of these intro lessons, the first 80%. Here's a quote from a book by Dennis Pagen. If you were a hang glider pilot, you'd know this name. You might know the name anyway because he wrote a book that a lot of pilots own called Understanding the Sky. One of his latest books, if not his latest, is called The Secrets of Champions, and it's a series of chapters that are basically interviews with some of the champions of hang gliding. So it's a book that's basically written on this very high level. The best in the world, telling you how to be the best in the world. So it's not really focused on beginners. But I came across this one statement where I saw, wait a minute, there's a hidden message in there that maybe, and Jim Lee is now flying sailplanes competitively. Anyway, here's what he wrote. And he won the U.S. hang gliding nationals a couple of years back in the 90s. To maximize climb rate, you have to analyze each 360. You cannot just lock in and climb if you want to excel. You have to work. You can get another 10% or more if you really put effort into it. So you can probably see where I'm going. I think it's fair, and one day I'll meet Jim and tell him I've been using his words this way and see if he is okay with it. But I think it's fair to read between the lines that if you're content to climb only 90% as fast as the very best, which I expect most of us would be content with that, then you don't have to analyze each 360. You can, for the most part, just lock in and climb. You don't have to work very hard, and you don't have to put much effort into it. So I think he just sneaked in a nice little nugget of wisdom for beginners and maybe just us weekend pilots. The guys who fly 100 or 200 hours a year or more might fly often enough to keep those expert skills really sharp. The rest of us might not. So when I give this live in person, I show the video there, and then we would arrive here and talk about it afterward. So in the video you saw the easiest 1, 2, 3 thermaling method, heard it explained. And just to refresh your memory, the 1 is for 1 circle, the 2 is for 2 checks, and the 3 is for 3 quarters. Now we're going to break that down a little more and get into some details on each of those 3 pieces. If you can just remember that, once, or those 6 words in flight, and if you're like me, your IQ drops about in half when you get airborne. So that's hard enough for me to remember just 6 words. But if you can remember just those 6 words, then that's a good start. But I'm going to try to put a little more in your head that's behind those 6 words. The 1 circle piece simply means that except when making a centering adjustment, fly a steady circle. By that I mean a constant airspeed and bank. Anytime you change your airspeed or bank, you're changing your turn radius. So every time you do that, you're moving the position of the center of your circle. And so the more you do that, and it's very difficult for your mind to process which way you're moving it. So what usually happens is the pilot moves his circle without knowing it. He thinks his circle is still in the same place, but he moved it and is just not aware of it. By the way, I should have mentioned this back when I was talking about entering a thermal, but I recommend that you very quickly go from your gliding speed and wings level to your circling pitch and bank. You should make that happen within 5 seconds. The longer it takes, the more you're moving your first circle once you get it established away from where you were when you started turning. You'll end up positioning, I wish I had a chart to draw this for you, but you'll end up, let's say it takes you a full 180-degree turn to get to your circling bank and airspeed. Then the center of the circle that you're you're about to fly will be beyond where you started circling and over to whatever direction you're turning, right or left. And a lot of pilots aren't aware of this, that this is happening. I was just working with a student who was stumped by one of the early steady circles exercises in the course. And it turned out that this was the issue. It took us a while to figure it out, is he was rolling into his turn too slow, and that was moving his circle over too far. And he had no idea that it would do that. And as soon as he started making his turn entry snappier, the problem went away. And also, while making this steady circle, your only inputs, other than steady ones if needed, are to counteract turbulence. If your nose gets popped, push it back down. If a wing gets lifted, push it back down. And steady inputs are often needed. Most gliders tend to want to roll into the turn more. This is true in hang gliders too. So it's common to need to give a little high stick, little high wing aileron, stick toward the high wing. But that's a steady input. So that's what I mean there. As far as pitch, hopefully you're trimmed so that you're not having to give any steady pitch input. That's one of the best tips to help you maintain steady pitch while circling is trim. Trim so that you're not having to push or pull constantly. Because trying to just do it by feel, when you get a little excited, you'll grip the stick and you'll end up pushing or pulling harder, whichever it is you're already doing, and your nose is just porpoising all over the place. Trim it so that you're just barely touching the stick, not pushing or pulling, and that'll help you. You shouldn't just take your hand off the stick pitch-wise. The main thing you're looking for is you shouldn't be pushing more than you're pulling on average, and you shouldn't be chasing the airspeed indicator because there's a lot of lag. But some pilots, thermal without the glider trimmed properly, so they're fully managing pitch actively all the time. Even in a smooth thermal, they're constantly having to hold the stick, and it's pretty difficult to constantly hold the stick in just the right place. Plus, if nothing else, it's a little fatiguing. Why do that? The lighter your grip on the stick, the more you can pay attention to what's happening due to the air. So I'm a big fan of trimming for the circumstance. If you can fly this steady circle, then it gives you what I believe is the ideal frame of reference for a heavier than air craft. We can't just stop in midair. If we could, that would be perfect. Just turn into a hot air balloon right in the middle of the thermal and camp there until we're at the top. That's what we're trying to do the best we can. So the best we can do is put the middle of our circle in the best lift. And if you can circle about a fixed point in the air mass, that's about as good a job as you can do. That's the best frame of reference. Because it at least means the center of your circle is stationary relative to the air mass. Now, I know some of you have seen this already, some have not, so bear with me if this is a repeat for you. In all my years of thinking about thermals, I think that maybe the most important characteristic of a thermal when it comes to figuring out how to use them well is whether the point where the column touches the ground is moving, drifting with the wind, or stationary. And we can debate and say, well, not all thermals are continuous columns, or maybe they're broken, column for a few minutes, then nothing, then more column for a few minutes. Maybe it's just bubbles, maybe it's just one bubble. But the column idea is probably easiest to picture, and any of those variations can fit within the column idea. So if you want to just talk about bubbles, then imagine the pink and yellow columns here aren't real things. Nothing's moving there, but only these black dots you see. That's the bubble of lift. In either case, the model applies. So don't get hung up on whether it's bubbles or columns or whatever. But the key point is the bottom of that column, whether it's continuously filled with lift or not, stationary or moving? And Dennis Pagen calls this the source. He uses the term, this is his terminology. He calls the point where it touches the ground the source, and calls these drifting source and stationary source thermals. The stationary source type are like what you would see in a plume of smoke coming from a campfire, a fire that's stationary. It's going to be very leaned with the wind. Where the drifting source type is going to look more like a dust devil, tornado, waterspout. It's more or less vertical. It might have some twists and turns to it, but it's more or less vertical, and the whole thing is drifting with the wind. My first 10 years, the only model I had in my head was the stationary source type, and I had not heard this terminology then. Or if I heard it, I didn't know what it meant, and so it went in one ear and out the other. But this yellow type thermal was the only notion of a thermal I had up until the 10-year point. And through some simulation I did with an add-on program for Microsoft Flight Simulator, I came to suspect that was not the way most thermals in reality were. When I changed the design of the thermals in that code to be like the drifting source type here, which I had never even thought of, I had to just brainstorm for 2 or 3 months, reread all my material, and finally kind of had this loose notion of, well, what if it's like a dust devil? Changed the code, made it like that, voila, it felt more like real thermals. Now I'm not having to fly straight upwind several seconds every circle just to keep from falling out. So over the years since then, I've been observing and pondering, and for a while I wanted to think, okay, well, they're just all drifting source, and there's no such thing as stationary source. And then over time I decided, well, no, there's both. I think there are both, but I think the better ones, the stronger ones, the ones that go higher, and definitely the ones that are easier to stay in, are the drifting source type. I think there are not very many stationary source thermals that go even high enough to make a cloud on a day with cumulus clouds. So the method, the EasyS 123 method, is designed around the drifting source type thermal. And when I switched and started thermaling that way, I started having so much better results. So we're still on the one circle part. I just showed you why the steady circle works so well, even in wind. In a drifting source thermal, the column and you are drifting downwind in unison if you place a steady circle inside that column. You just all drift downwind together, nice and happy. Doesn't take a whole lot of effort to stay in it. So, what is the right airspeed? So we talked about the steadiness part, but what airspeed should you be flying? And the best answer I've come up with yet is this one: as slow as possible while maintaining adequate control. Of course, if you're in turbulence, you need a little more speed because you don't want to be stalling, you especially don't want to be spinning, especially if you're in a gaggle and there are gliders under you. In a gaggle, you want a little extra speed just to have more control authority for collision avoidance purposes. The main benefit of a lower airspeed, contrary to what some of us might think, is that it makes a smaller circle. I know for years I thought, well, slower is better because it moves me on my polar more toward minimum sink. So I was assuming I wasn't already flying at minimum sink, where going slower would actually make things worse. But the main benefit, I believe, in flying slower is your circles are smaller. At a given bank angle, the lower your airspeed, the smaller your circle. Think about a Hawk at a 30-degree bank and a 747 at a 30-degree bank. The Hawk's going to make a 50 or 100-foot circle. 747 a few mile diameter circle. And the only difference, the main difference, is their speed. So what's the optimum bank? The general answer I give is whatever gives you a 20-second circle. And I have paraglider and hang glider pilots in this course too sometimes, so for them, giving a bank angle is not so useful. Hang glider and paraglider pilot has nothing of a fixed geometry out in front of them to use to reference for bank angle. And even in sailplanes, we don't have a good bank angle reference in most sailplanes. You can use the screws around an instrument if they're in an even 4-hole pattern to tell you where 45 degrees is, but still you're using 2 little screws a couple of inches apart, a few feet in front of you. It's not a high fidelity angle measurement device. But a 20-second circle is pretty standard. It'll fit in most thermals. In some regions where thermals are bigger, you can routinely fly 30-second circles and do just fine. In some regions where thermals tend to be narrower, or on days when the thermals are narrower, you might fly 15-second circles. In a sailplane, it's rarely useful to fly tighter than a 15-second circle. Hang gliders might get down to 10 or 12 sometimes. This note is mainly for hang gliders. They can get down to 10, maybe. Definitely paragliders can. In a sailplane, I doubt you'll go to 10 seconds. Not very often. And circle duration is directly proportional to airspeed. So if you're holding, and this is similar to what I was saying before, that 747 is going to take a lot longer. Not just fly a bigger circle. It's going to take a lot longer to complete that circle than the Hawk. And the rule is simply directly proportional. If you double your speed, it takes you twice as long to make a circle. Now, for someone who's used to driving cars and not flying airplanes, this makes no sense. Because if you just go out in a big parking lot and set your steering wheel to a certain angle and drive 5 miles an hour and clock your circle, and then you drive 10 miles an hour and clock your circle, the second time at 10 miles an hour it took you half as long, not twice as long. So this is counterintuitive if all you've ever driven are cars that have a firm grasp on the ground with their tires. So this is the way it works in aircraft. Double the speed doesn't get you around the circle twice as fast, half as fast. This means that slower gliders can more easily fly lower duration circles. That's why I gave those lower numbers a minute ago for slower flying gliders. Now here's another one that's even less intuitive. At a given bank angle, the diameter of your circle, and that's what really matters. Duration is just kind of a reference that gets us toward diameter. Diameter is really what matters. How big is our circle? And your diameter is a function of the square of airspeed. So if you increase your airspeed 20%, while your duration increases only 20%, because that's directly proportional, as we just said, but your diameter goes up 1.2 squared. So it becomes 144% of what it was before. So this is why I believe that the main benefit of flying slower while circling is the impact it has on the size of your circle. And the smaller the circle, the closer you are while circling to the center of the thermal where the lift is best. So now on to the 2 checks piece, which I like to call the check twice rule. And it is simply a decision tool. So if you want to quiet your mind, if you're used to your mind constantly being busy with, excuse me, should I make an adjustment? Should I not? What direction should I make it? Excuse me. Let this be your decision tool for a while and see how it works out. I think it's going to work out pretty well, especially if you're currently losing more thermals than you think you should. It's a simple decision tool, and it says you should make a centering adjustment if and only if you find what I sometimes call a hot spot. That really just means the best point in your circle. It doesn't have to really be a good hot point, but if it's clearly the best point in your circle, and it's roughly in the same place on your circle, 2 circles in a row. So if you fly one full circle and say, the north side was best, fly one more full circle and go, yeah, the north side's still best, then check twice rule just kicked in and said you need to move north. If you came back around the second time and on the second circle you found, well, the southeast side seems to be best now. Well, then in one circle said north was best, one said southeast was best. The check twice rule says stay where you are. Just hold your steady circle because it's not clear which direction you should move. That simple rule, I think, is the main thing, in addition to flying a steady circle. But this was really the main thing that put my thermaling on track 10 years into flying. It helps you avoid adjustment decisions based on just a few seconds of data. And a lot of us tend to do that. We very heavily weight the last 5 seconds we've heard from the vario. And with a 20-second circle, that's just a quarter of the way around the circle. Why are we ignoring the other 3/4 of the circle and only listening to the last 5 seconds? Randomness in the thermal. I mean, where a thermal plows up through stationary air, there's a lot of swirling and churning going on. And if you're especially out near the edge of that thermal, you're getting a lot of these random little eddies of air that can make anything happen for a few seconds. But if you come back around 20 seconds later, that eddy may have worn itself out or spun out of the thermal, or it's not there anymore. So this helps you weed out a lot of the random stuff going on in the thermal. I made a lot of wrong adjustment decisions over 10 years' time. I know I did. That's just saying the same thing. Now, to do this does require some mental averaging, mapping the lift strength around your circle. Now, it really doesn't have to be all that complex. If you can just sort of memorize what you heard in the vario at a certain point, and then listen around the circle for it to ever exceed that. That's really all you have to do. Does it ever exceed the high point I just registered in my head before I come back around to that same point? That's really all you're doing. A lot of flight computers nowadays, things like LK8000, XC-SOAR, CU Mobile, there are all sorts of other big moving map displays that will help map the lift strength around your circle. I'd caution you, though, that the same lag that exists in your vario exists in these things. Maybe even more so. Because these things are often using GPS to come up with your speed, your direction. So the only way GPS knows your speed is by comparing two data points. So even more lag there to compute that, essentially average it between those 2 data points. So don't think you can just rely on this. Pay attention to what you're hearing in your vario and what you're feeling. But the basic notion is just try to note mentally where the strongest point was around your last circle. You need to be able to mentally mark your hot spot, and I think that's part of the reason that a lot of pilots don't naturally fall into this way of thermaling, is it's not always easy. How do you mark it? Well, The most universal way is by compass direction. But a lot of the time we're not really aware of compass direction. Probably the easier way, the more user-friendly way, is pick some distinct feature out the window. Preferably high up on the horizon, because if you're drifting with the wind, your angle toward anything on the ground, your bearing to anything on the ground changes as you drift, unless that thing is straight upwind or straight downwind. And if it's straight downwind, it still could change if you drift over the top of it. So pick you a spot, a few miles out on the horizon, and say, okay, it's strongest on the side toward that lake, or that tower, or that mountain, or that town, or whatever. And anywhere within about 30 degrees is accurate enough. So don't get bent out of shape trying to get it down to 10-degree accuracy. And just repeat what the check twice rule says, and put a little emphasis on one point. If there's not a definite best side of the circle, you are usually better off to stay put. Hold your bank. Hold what you have. If it's not definite, just stay with it. It could just be a tiny little fluctuation in turbulence. And if it's not definite, what that tells you is you're pretty darn well centered. So be happy about that. When I first started getting decent at thermaling after practicing this method, I found I would get discontented when I got perfectly centered. The vario was just the same droning tone all the way around the circle, and somehow my brain would make that 4-knot climb rate sound like 1 knot, because I was no longer hearing the increase in tones as I went from the bad side to the good side of a circle. So I had to teach myself, as I was relearning how to thermal, when you start feeling like that, look at your vario. Because in my hang glider, if I didn't look to one side, I saw no instruments. Instruments were over to the side. I had to choose to look over to one side, 90 degrees to the left. Look and see what your climb rate is, Eric. And most of the time I'd look and go, wow, that's not bad. I guess I'll stay here. So if you're not used to being perfectly centered and just holding a steady pitch and bank, get ready for it mentally. It might take a little work to convince yourself that you're good. You don't need to make an adjustment. All right, on to part 3. So 1 circle, 2 checks, 3 quarters. And this is just a shorthand way of describing the centering method that I would recommend, especially to the beginner or anyone losing thermals, and that is called the 270 method, which says that 3/4 of a circle past your hot spot, the best spot in your circle. And you've checked it twice, remember? So it was there twice. 3/4 of a circle beyond that spot, you level out at least a little bit for 2 or 3 seconds. 2 or 3 is enough usually. And then you just roll back into your steady bank and start over. Now you restart your checking and check a couple more circles. And you probably know this already. You'll actually start your rollout a bit before 3/4. If you wait till, say, if you've decided the north side of your thermal is the best side that you need to move north, if you wait till you're on a north heading to start rolling the wings level, you'll overshoot. So if you're turning left and you do that, you may end up moving your circle northwest. So depending on how quickly you roll in and out of this adjustment, you may need to start that turn 30 to 50 degrees before the heading that you're wanting to move. With a 20-second circle, this 3/4 adjustment gives you, I should change this slide, this isn't entirely accurate, it gives you 15 seconds between where the best side of the circle is and where the center of your adjustment is. So normally you're not going to be right on the north side of your circle when you say, this is the best point in the circle. You really need to fly a few seconds farther and see whether it gets better yet. So normally you might be a 1/4 of a circle past the best point before you're sure you're past the best point. And then you remember back, yes, it was the north side that was best. And like I said before, you're going to start your rollout a little bit before you're on a north heading, but still you're probably going to get close to 10 seconds between when you decide to make your adjustment and when you start making it. And compared to the way I was flying at the 10-year point, this was a world of time. Maybe this is an eternity to wait 10 seconds after I've made my decision. But that just makes it so much more relaxed. In fact, sometimes in that 10 seconds, I might get a little bit distracted and miss my adjustment and go, oh, I passed it, I missed it. And I just have to laugh at myself. It's no big deal. I just come back around and next time I make it. I never have lost a thermal because I did that, because I took 3 turns instead of 2. And it's neat to see that you just don't have to be that snappy and instant with your responses. In my case, they were making me worse. And as you experiment with this, you'll notice, and if you haven't already, the larger the strength difference across your circle, the longer the adjustment is appropriate. So if there's just a very slight lift strength difference, then just make a real quick adjustment. Just roll a little bit of the way level and right back. If there's a big difference, you might go all the way to level and then back to your bank. So you can play with that. You can refine the technique to vary the size of your adjustment based on the difference in lift strength across your circle. This is just a little graphic showing what the 3/4 adjustment looks like. I've colored red the best lift part of the circle, and sometimes it'll be like this, where everywhere from 90 degrees or more of your circle, it was kind of all the same to you. You couldn't differentiate, but it was all better than the rest of the circle. Just average that out and aim for the middle. Say the northwest is the direction I should move. Northwest is the best spot. So if you're turning right, here is where you would want to be level if you were going all the way to wings level. If you were just going halfway to wings level, this is where you'd want to be halfway to wings level. So this is where you'd want the middle of your adjustment to be, 270 degrees past the best spot. So here's just a cute little animation of that. Right about there is where you level out. If you were turning left, it'd be right here. Both of these, the common factor here is they're both leveling out on a northwest heading, because you want to move your circle to the northwest, and then you quickly get back into the previous bank and airspeed, and voila, you've moved your circle to the northwest. Now, just to give you a little idea of how big an adjustment creates what size move, because a lot of pilots are surprised to see this chart. If you hold your wings level, so if I simplified the math, so assume you could instantaneously go from your circling bank to wings level instantly, and then when you get ready to go back to your bank, you could instantly return to your bank. So given that little approximation, if you hold level for just 1/6 of the duration of your circle, you move your circle this much, half a diameter. So now you're going to pass right through dead center of your previous circle. So if you're using our theoretical ideal 20% circle, that's 3.3 seconds. Level, hold it for 3.3, then go back and you've moved half a circle diameter. And if you want to define how far you've moved it slightly differently, look at this. With a half a diameter move, only 1/3 of your new circle is inside the old circle. I'm of the mindset that anything bigger than that is dangerous, because at least you don't know. If we were circling in this one on the left first and it seemed better here, well, then it's probably a good idea to move in this direction some, but you really don't know what's out here. You haven't been out there to sample it. So you don't want to go too far in this direction, or you may drop all the way out of the thermal. So I say beware an adjustment larger than a half diameter. 3 seconds A 3-second adjustment is about as big as I would recommend. And that is the easy as 1, 2, 3 method. 1 circle, 2 checks, 3 quarters. So after you've mastered it, what next? You can occasionally drop the check twice rule. You can just check once. It's a bit of a gamble because you may be reacting to just turbulence, something random and transient. But if you have good enough skills and you practice all the rest of the method properly and you don't make too big an adjustment, then worst case, you just make your situation a little bit worse, but you still have part of your circle in the lift and you can just move it back the opposite direction. If you make a move to the north and it turns out to be worse, then you can remember, well, I just moved north, that made it worse, let me move back to the south, and that's essentially undoing the adjustment I just made. If you make adjustments like I used to, and just sort of randomly reacting instantly, not randomly, but reacting instantly to everything I experienced, I couldn't tell you what was becoming of the position of the center of my thermal. So if I made a bad move, I had no idea what direction to move to undo it. So that's one of the really nice things about a method like this, is it has a really easy built-in undo button. I like to think of the check twice rule though like training wheels on a bike, except unlike a bike, you can put the training wheels back on mid-flight, off and on at will. I do recommend though, if you've been losing more thermals than you think you should, that you keep the check twice rule consistently for a good period of time, for your next several, thermaling hours maybe, and it will teach you that you can relax your way of thermaling. You don't have to make so many sudden adjustments, and you can actually do better by relaxing. And it may take some time to break habits. Old habits die hard, so the longer you've been flying a certain way, the harder it is to try a new way. I already said that. Don't know that I need to spend much time here, but if you're not already using Condor, I recommend it. It's good for thermaling. They're not perfect. The thermals are not exactly realistic. They are good enough that probably only at the really elite level will you find that you're training yourself to do less than ideal things by flying in Condor. For the vast majority of us, we will be better pilots for having practiced in Condor. But you can get a lot more experience in less time and money. You can do it anywhere, anytime. You don't have to go through all the typical overhead of a flight. You can just fly. You can focus on whatever skill you want. You can fine-tune the challenge, which is what I do with the exercises throughout the course. I tweak the challenge for that exercise, and I step you through in a logical progression from easy to difficult. You can see the thermals, which I already mentioned the value in that. I mentioned it for snakiness purposes, but also, did that thermal die, or did I lose it? And I found also in Condor rather, that when I would look back thinking the thermal died, often enough I'd see that it didn't. And that's a little bit of a hit to my ego, but it was worth it because it pointed out I had room to learn. And largely because of being able to see the thermals in Condor, I forced myself to deal with issues that I didn't know I had because it hadn't been proven to me. You can't prove it in real life very often, unless there's a gaggle of gliders that are still climbing just fine. But in that case, you're probably not going to lose the thermal because it's right there marked for you. You can restart and try the exact same thermal again. That's really valuable. We don't get to do that in real life. You test new ideas like easy as 1, 2, 3 method with less risk of giving up your precious time and altitude, the cost of a tow, whatever. And Condor is fun just to get online and fly with other people. And I was not all that competitive when I bought Condor. I thought, well, this is silly. Why does every flight have to have a task? oh well, whatever, I'll get over it. I'll make myself a task and then I'll just go fly. And I started flying online and finding I had the bug. It makes competition, lights us up, a lot of us. And when you compete in the same type glider, in the same conditions, over the same course, if you're consistently, lower than middle of the pack, it's hard to deny that there's room for improvement. And if you get your competitive juices going at all, that's all the motivation you need to figure out what it is you need to improve and get about doing it. And ultimately, you get better. The idea of simulation is to ingrain ways of doing things so that in real life, you don't have to think so much about it. You just do it. Real life becomes easier. This is a note that a paraglider pilot, and he was a career jet pilot, I think he's still flying, that he shared with me after his first few days of using Condor. He said, I think I've learned more about thermals using Condor these last few days than I did in the 2 $500 thermal clinics I've done the last couple of years. I haven't heard of this sort of thing, a thermal clinic, yet in the sailplane world, but in the hang gliding and paragliding world, often the pros will host what they call a thermal clinic, and they'll open it up usually to a limited number of pilots, and those pilots will fly in from wherever they live, stay the weekend or a few nights, and weather permitting, they'll go fly, and they'll do some classroom time. But they try really hard to get to go fly. And flying brings with it all this overhead. Driving to the site, got to give a site safety briefing, got to look at the landing field, check out the hazards, look at the launch, check out hazards, wait for the right launch conditions, especially if you're launching off a mountain. The right launch conditions are not a given that they'll even happen today. Good thermal conditions, who knows, are they going to happen today or not? So this doesn't surprise me at all. And the $500 is just what he paid for the entry fee. That's not even counting his travel cost and lodging and food. There's a lot to be learned. If what you really want is to learn to thermal better, you're definitely going to get your money's worth out of Condor more than just about any other way, more than any other way I've ever known of. What next? I highly recommend you to try this method. Try it, practice it. I think it'll work well for you. If you're interested, use the Condor and the course exercises I've prepared to work on it. The first 8 or 10 exercises step you through the elements of the method in very slow progression so you can help nail every detail of it. Maybe you just want to participate in some more lectures. I think I have 17 right now on a variety of topics, mostly thermaling and cross-country related. And my lectures, I don't say this much about simulation in most of my lectures. My main interest is in helping you in your real-world flying. I only mention simulation where I think that's an end to the means of better real-world flying, easier real-world flying. But here's some more lectures you might want. You might want the course welcome introduction lecture. It just explains how the course works, gives you a little history of soaring, some of the mental side of soaring. Finding near-miss thermals is probably the second in number 2 of my lectures in terms of practical value. When I figured this technique out and started using it, it was as if there were twice as many thermals in the world. And I just figured that out 15 years into flying. So after 15 years, it suddenly felt like there were twice as many thermals just by knowing what I discussed there. Finding thermals, I have a 2-part series on that. It may turn into 3 eventually because that's a topic you can talk and write about for a long, long time and still find half of your thermals by dumb luck. But it's interesting to talk about. And if you're already staying up, having good long thermal flights, not losing thermals, then that's a good place to put some more study. Several more lectures. Mentioned the mailing list. On the website, if you didn't see it already, on the lectures page, there's a link to a handout, a little one-page kind of a cheat sheet. You can, fold it up and stuff it in your flying bag or something if you want to review it at the airfield. That's it. That's all I have tonight. Any comments or questions?